Good morning and welcome to Inquirer Live. I'm Trudy Rubin, Worldview columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I'm honored to be joined by Ambassador Sergiy Kyslytsya, the permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations. This couldn't be a more timely moment to discuss the way forward for Ukraine and how it can win Putin's brutal war. Ambassador Kyslytsya has very deep foreign affairs experience for Ukraine. He's a former deputy foreign minister from 2014 to 2019, where he had to deal with international response to Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and annexation of Crimea. He's also known for his outspokenness at the UN. At the beginning of this war, Kyslytsya called upon the Russian representative when Russia was serving in the Security Council presidency and told him to tell Foreign Minister Lavrov to do everything possible to stop the war. And when, not surprisingly, the Russian representative refused, the ambassador Kyslytsya told the Russian that war criminals go straight to hell. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the discussion, you can submit questions to Ambassador Kyslytsya. To do so, please ask your questions in the comments section at the bottom of this page. If you're watching from social media, please visit inquirer.com/live. That's inquirer.com/live to submit your questions. And now I'm pleased to be able to join the ambassador to talk about the way forward in Putin's awful war. Given what you said about war criminals, Mr. Ambassador, I'm wondering whether you think Putin will ever be held responsible. As you know, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was speaking to a special session of the Human Rights Council just this week and talking about 1,000 civilians killed in the suburbs north of Kiev, many of them deliberately executed. And these figures will increase as more digging goes on. So what about it? I mean, can the UN hold Putin accountable? Do you have any faith that anyone or any organization will?
Good morning, Trudy. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm happy to be with you and with your listeners and viewers. I think that in the eyes of the majority of morally right citizens of this planet, Putin is already responsible. So I understand your question as if we are speaking about criminal responsibility beyond the moral and political responsibility. You know, there were times during the war that was launched and waged by Slobodan Milosevic that nobody believed that he would find himself on the bench of a tribunal in The Hague, and he ended up there. So I think that Putin will be responsible should he stay alive by the time the tribunal is launched by all of us. I need to say that if he is not brought to the account, that is going to be the failure of the entire democratic world, the entire community of nations, and that will be one of the most sad pages in the modern history of the world. So I think it is our joint task to bring him to account.
Watching what is going on in Ukraine, from the utter destruction of Mariupol to the crimes revealed in village after village, town after town. It is quite staggering looking at what appears to be deliberate targeting of civilians. Is this the Russian way of war? To what do you attribute this deliberate massacring of innocent men, women, and children, not to mention hospitals, schools, and kindergartens?
It's something that is so dramatically evil that it is very uh, difficult not to get emotional giving the sharing thoughts about it. But matter of factly, they do target civilians. Matter of factly, they do kill civilians, and they do it on purpose, in spite of what the Russian representatives may say in many meetings here in New York. Why do they do that? That is a very complex question. It is a combination of several factors. The primary factor is the determination of the Russian dictator to eliminate Ukraine as an independent nation. Um, the second factor is that the value of human life in Russia, be it a Russian life or foreign life, is at the lowest. They have never reached, never in their history, I dare to say, they have never reached a point where the Russian society and Russian individuals would value human life to the extent that they would fight very hard to stop atrocities. They've been victimized even before the Bolsheviks and Stalin took the power in Russia. Another factor is that the Russian soldiers, as citizens of their country, are so repressed in the country where they are policed and controlled by the government and by the society, that when they find themselves at loose in a foreign country, they do the worst kind of things that anyone can do. So, but the bottom line is that it's a conscious, informed decision of the Russian leadership and primarily of President Putin to destroy Ukraine as a nation and to break the spirit of every Ukrainian to the extent that, in his opinion, we would never, ever again try to be independent.
How do you deal with it at the UN? I mean, you have a Russian permanent representative who totally denies that Russia commits atrocities, just as President Putin denies it constantly in public and privately with foreign officials. How do you handle that, both professionally and emotionally?
Well, I've said on many occasions that I realized quite soon that, quite early rather, that I don't need and I should not emotionally engage in a situation where the Russian envoy is so blatantly drooling his lies. Because if I engage emotionally, I kind of undermine my ability to operate, and that will undermine my purpose, the Security Council or the General Assembly, to represent my country effectively. So I do not engage emotionally. And an important factor is that not only myself, but our allies and partners, we feel morally right. And when you have this feeling of being morally right, it kind of firewalls you from the um, drivel that Russian envoy pours on us at every single meeting. Um, And then, believe it or not, the majority, if not all, the arguments and so-called facts that the Russians try to sell us, they are so primitive in a way that unless one is a total degenerate, nobody really believes them. So it's kind of combination of emotions and the feeling of being morally right, as I said.
It seems that with the level of outrageousness of the war, one would think the UN could do more. And we already have a question here about whether, why can't the UN act to defend this member state and bar Russia from the Security Council seat? I know you've had thoughts on this. Is the UN capable of acting against Putin's war, or is the veto in the Security Council just an immovable barrier to effective UN action?
Well, it's a kind of question that we can discuss for hours, but let me make an effort.
So just briefly.
Right, let me make an effort and explain it kind of in a framework way. Well, first of all, the United Nations is not a separate entity or body that has its own destiny flying on a separate orbit. The United Nations is a body where all the governments have the right to guide the United Nations, whereas the the Security Council are vested with the special veto right that was designed in the middle of the last century, and to the United States it was probably the most important thing when they decided to join the United Nations, because without the veto right we wouldn't have the United Nations in the first place. Remember what happened to the League of Nations, that the US Congress refused to allow the administration of Woodrow Wilson to join because the US had no control over the decision-making process in the League of Nations. So when we say, why does the United Nations doesn't do this or that, then we have to ask our own governments. And then in this case, we should ask the government of in Washington, in London, in Paris, in Beijing, and unfortunately in Moscow. Secondly, we should not really generalize and overly criticize the United Nations for inability to act, because in fact, the United Nations is several pillars, including such an important pillar at the General Assembly. And the General Assembly proves to be quite efficient and outspoken since the latest invasion of Russia of Ukraine. And the General Assembly approved with the overwhelming majority at least two resolutions. The first one, where the General Assembly called the Russian actions as aggression, and the second one on the humanitarian issues, as well as the third resolution about the stripping of Russia of its membership rights in the Human Rights Council. So I dare to say that the General Assembly, against the backdrop of inability of the Security Council to deliver on the primary purpose of existence of the Security Council, is doing quite fine. And also the final thing is that the United Nations is also a family of dozens of agencies, including humanitarian agencies, that are quite efficient, although not without problems, in delivering the so much needed humanitarian assistance, both in Ukraine and in the countries concerned, primarily the bordering countries to Ukraine.
Let me ask you just one more UN-related question, and then move on to broader issues. One of the consequences of Putin's war is the inability of Ukraine to export its grain, which is of critical importance to many parts of the world for basic foodstuffs. Now, the main export port is Odessa, which the Russians are blockading. Uh, there have been some experts, including retired US generals that I've spoken to, who have talked about the need for an international escort for ships coming to Odessa to go through the Russian blockade. Is this something that the UN would ever let itself be involved in? Or would this fall victim to a Russian veto that would be required?
Look, this war and the whole dynamics of this war is the war of choice of just one person. So we are not in the kind of dynamics where a collective decision, be it of the General Assembly or of the Security Council, will change the opinion of the person of interest. So if there is a decision of the Security Council that would mandate any kind of monitoring or escort, as you say, of the export of the grain from Ukraine, that will totally depend on the Putin's desire to allow his ambassador not to oppose such a decision. And that is a desirable course of actions. But then we have to ask ourselves, what should be the reason why this person may allow that to happen? He is in a position where he is losing the war, whether he is ready or not to admit it, while we are not still winning the war. I mean, that's kind of situation where they are losing the war and we're not winning the war, but we will win eventually. He is in a position where he desperately tries to do everything to immobilize Ukraine, be it in terms of the spirit of the Ukrainian army or Ukrainian civilians. He is in a position where he does everything to drain us economically. So why in the world, we may ask ourselves, he may allow this grain to be exported from Ukraine to help the third world countries? Well, then we still believe that he has some scruples of moral dignity and responsibility. So in other words, the Security Council decision on escort or monitoring may be very helpful because it will set up the rules of engagement or the rules of play, you know. But the Security Council has no ability to change the mindset of the Russian dictator.
At this point, do you see anything on the horizon that can change his mind? What about sanctions?
What can change his mind is that he finally comes to terms that he is losing the war and he is about to lose the war altogether. And then the issue comes how he manages to run his country as a dictator whose credibility and power suffered such a global blow. So that he would need to be very creative in designing a scheme of actions and propaganda that will allow him to survive as a dictator. And part of this design can be, in theory at least, doing things that will win at least some support, including in the General Assembly or worldwide, for his course of actions. So the extent of his cooperation, his post-war cooperation with the international community, may have certain impact on the perception of the global community about Russia as a dictatorial state if Putin is still in power. And that is a very, very important moment where all of us should be very careful. And we should stay very clear that even if he cooperates with the international community in a post-war environment, that will not whitewash his responsibility for the crimes that have been committed during the war, and that will not whitewash and give him any immunity from the responsibility for the crimes committed.
You talk about forcing him to recognize that he can't win the war. In your view, at this point in time, on the military front, is NATO doing enough to help Ukraine get to the point where Putin understands that this war cannot be won by Russia?
I'm not in a position, Trudy, to evaluate NATO. I mean, we have a separate ambassador to NATO. I just had a conversation with her this morning on work-related issues. So it's up to her to say whether NATO, according to the Ukrainian government, is doing enough or not. I think that NATO is currently at a very, very serious juncture when, as we heard yesterday, Finland is willing to join and Sweden is about to announce their decision on joining NATO. We also heard from Turkey, from Erdogan, who has a clear reservation concerning the potential membership of the Scandinavian countries in NATO. NATO is an important alliance. We are unfortunately not part of NATO due to a sequence of events that took place in Europe in the last 30 years. And one of the most prominent failure of NATO and Ukraine, both sides are guilty for that, is 2008 summit in Bucharest. But given the level of threats that Putin and his henchmen sent to NATO countries, including to the potential future members like Finland and Sweden, I mean, the Russian deputy ambassador, I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, literally threatened those two countries to the extent that if those kind of threats were addressed to Ukraine, we would call a Security Council meeting. And we would like then to ask the Russians to say the same things on record, because that constitutes a violation of the UN Charter. So NATO has a very important role to demonstrate the united, solid position and determination, resolution to defend every single NATO country, be it small Lithuania or Poland or Germany or whoever, and that's already quite a task to them.
Do you think that Putin believes NATO will defend every member?
I am afraid I have no ability to read his mind, but I think that it's our common job, and especially the job of NATO countries, to leave no doubts that they will defend, be it Lithuania, Estonia, or be it Poland, or be it any other country of NATO, with the whole resolution and immediately, instantaneously.
I have a question here about Finland and Sweden, asking whether their NATO application complicates things for Ukraine. And another question saying it's going to irritate Putin and likely result in more aggression and threats from Moscow. From Ukraine's point of view, is Finland's likely application and Sweden's likely application helpful to your cause?
I would answer to this question by saying that the stronger Europe is, the better for Ukraine. And it is up to the people of Finland and people of Sweden to decide their security arrangements. And that's a position that should be equally applied to the people of Ukraine. But I do not agree with the policy of those who, for many years, for many decades, were defending appeasement with Putin, who were saying that let us not irritate him, let us be compliant with his wishes, and that will prevent all of us from conflicts. And the action of Putin in Ukraine, and not only in Ukraine, has proven so many times that he has no respect of you being polite or compliant or complacent. The only course of action that he acknowledges, I would not say recognize or appreciates, but acknowledges, is your strength. And you should be determined in beefing up your strength and proving at any given moment of time that you are strong enough to stand against him.
You have said just now that Ukraine will win. Many people are worried that the war might devolve into a stalemate, where Russia focuses on the east and the south, as it's doing at the moment, and tries to take Odessa, but basically leaves a stalemate in which there's a frozen conflict. Is this of great concern to Ukraine, and what further help, and you don't have to go into specifics on weapons, but what will it take to help Ukraine win rather than simply be stuck in another frozen conflict that saps its manpower and its economy?
Well, I need to say that I believe that it is not in the interest of Putin to turn this current war in a frozen conflict. It may be the last option for him, but it is certainly not his choice for many reasons. Primarily because it's going to be a huge defeat to his standing, both internationally and inside the country. Any dictator cannot survive such humiliation and blow as claiming to be armed forces number 2 in the world and that not being able to defeat Ukraine that is not even a NATO member. Well, secondly, economically and politically, it is so painful to the regime of Putin that I'm not sure that even if the sanctions are not very efficient at the moment or not efficient enough, that he can survive the sanctions for a prolonged period of time, for a number of years, because they will start hitting the Russian economy more than the economic blockade of the Soviet Union undermined the potential of the Soviet Union in the Soviet times. So, and another important thing is that I don't think that the Ukrainians will allow Putin and his army to control parts of the territories that he invaded after the 24th of February for a prolonged period of time, because we speak in this case about the clear cases of atrocities and situations where Ukrainians have to live under the occupation, being tortured, killed, and kidnapped and detained to the scale that is only comparable to the Nazi occupation. And I apologize for the noise, but we are in New York, and we used to live in constant 24/7 noise. We are quite paranoid when it is quiet.
What do you think it would take to get Putin to admit that he was fighting Putin's war? I mean, I recall when you were questioned by a reporter about the Russian representative to the UN's claim that the military operation in Ukraine isn't called a war. You said, quote, "You want me to dissect the crazy lunatic semantics of a person whose president violates the charter, whose president declared a war, and he's playing with words." What is going to press Putin to recognize reality here and, as you say, realize he can't win?
Truly, with all my respect, and I truly respect you because you are one of the most insightful and seasoned journalists I met. It's a matter of fact and logic. I mean, a criminal should not, we don't really need a recognition from the criminal that he committed a crime. We just need the ruling an application of the articles of books of law to identify certain action as an act of crime. So basically, I cannot care much about what he thinks and what he admits. I mean, he is a criminal. He is a criminal both from the point of view of international law, and in fact, maybe laughable to many, but in fact, even from the point of view of the criminal code of the Russian Federation. And the criminal code of the Russian Federation has a couple of articles, including the article that says that preparation and waging of war is a criminal offense. And there is a sanction for such action up to 15 years of incarceration. So basically, I'm sorry to say that even by the Russian standards, if there are any standards at all in Russia, that's a criminal offense. So I can give a monkeys about whether he admits or not that he is a war criminal.
Do you believe that most Russians, as the polls, if one believes them in Russia, claim, believe Putin's lies? Or how do you explain the fact that Russians seem to be buying into this claim of special military operation against Nazis?
How do we explain, Trudy, that the majority of Germans under Hitler sincerely supported him? How do we explain that the majority of Germans led Hitler to accumulate as much power as he did to allow him to launch an offensive that eventually became the Second World War? I think that human beings are equally the same, be Germans or Russians. So it's not like something special or intrinsic to the Russian DNA or society. Unfortunately, the way Europeans and North Americans behaved with respect to the rise of Hitler in the 30s of the past century is comparable to how the collective West treated Putin for the last 20 plus years. And the level of our complacency with his plans and actions allowed him to build a society where almost every individual is controlled by his state and by propaganda. So I'm not surprised. But let me tell you that many politicians and experts, they say that as soon as there is no control over the media, the polls will give you entirely different picture and different percentage of the Russian sentiments. That may be easily the case, but it will not change the susceptibility, the readiness of the Russian society to switch again to the support of a dictator if the Russian society is not sanitized and is not brought to the path of developing truly democratic country where we have a rule of law and respect of law.
I have a question here on the Ukrainian side of the equation. The listener asks, if Ukraine is successful, I presume, meaning pushing Russia back, will Zelensky's prestige be great enough so that he can pass radical economic and political reforms that were previously stymied? Or will Zelensky follow Churchill from charismatic wartime leader to post-war domestic disillusionment and a return to the political divisions that existed in Ukraine prior to the war?
I don't want to offend my British friends, but Churchill was not an angel, you know. There were many reasons why Churchill lost elections, and the comparison of Zelensky to Churchill is quite artificial, if I may. When the war is over, the success of Ukraine in restoring Ukraine, rebuilding Ukraine, giving the level of damage is only possible if there is a joint action of our European, North American, Japanese, Australian, and other friends is there. And it will require an unprecedented or only comparable to the Marshall Plan level of investments. And when foreign governments, European governments, North American governments, commit to invest that sum of money, or they will push or promote or facilitate private business investments in Ukraine, they would certainly expect from the Parliament of Ukraine, from the government of Ukraine, to act according to the rules of free market and rules of rule of law, and where the courts are in place to defend the investments or to recover the investments. So I think that the reforms in Ukraine that are necessary, the continuation rather of the reforms, will be part and parcel of the effort of the international community to restore Ukraine. And Then, as I had a conversation with one of my European friends, I explained to that European friend that, to have Ukraine as a candidate, if not a member of the European Union, it's even business advantageous to the European Union, because if you restore and you invest so much money in such a huge territory, right? You want it to be part of your business community, part of your market. It does not exist separately, but exists as part and parcel of your economy. So I think that this logic provides for a concerted actions of everyone, including the parliament and the government of Ukraine, when it comes to the eventual restoration and recovery of Ukraine.
For that recovery, will it be necessary for Ukraine to have an expedited entry into the European Union? As you know, President Macron of France just made comments that seem to indicate he saw Ukraine's potential EU membership as decades off. Say, don't hesitate to say.
No. It's not about hesitating. It is about. I'm not defending Macron. No, and I should not be in agreement with Macron. He's not my president, But unfortunately, oftentimes people cut off the context and cherry pick statements of the foreign leaders. And one of the examples of cherry picking of Macron's statements lately, when I saw a piece of information that would say that Macron called not to humiliate Putin. And when I look into the original French text, it was totally different context. So we should not be carried away by some sexy or cherry-picked attributions to what foreign leaders say. We have to be more in the context. I think that what is fundamentally important is that Ukraine is recognized as a candidate country as early as next month, in June. And I understand that is a timeline of the decision-making process and review. Because the recognition of the status of a candidate country already opens so many avenues of practical cooperation that are not available to non-candidate countries. And then the whole dynamics of implementation of the cooperation as a candidate country with the European Union will eventually expedite the imminent decision, and it's my opinion an imminent decision, to accept Ukraine as a member state. And I say that we should not really spend so much time and read the tea leaves, whether it happens in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now,
In terms of Ukraine's survival after however this war ends, first of all, what would victory mean to Ukraine? I know that President Zelensky formally said it meant pushing Russia back to the pre-Putin's war boundaries, pre-February 24th, 2022. Now he says it means taking back all Russian seized territory, including Crimea. Can you envision this in the foreseeable? or would this be a long-term goal? What would victory mean at this point for Ukraine?
Can I return a question? Can I ask you what victory would mean to the United States? What victory would mean to the entire democratic community of nations? The military defeat of Russia in the territory of Ukraine is imminent, and it will take place, but it will not be the victory neither for the Ukrainians nor for the entire democratic community of nations, because we need to ensure such a victory that will eliminate or minimize to the extent possible the recurrence, the repetition of this aggression. The worst case scenario is that we defeat, together with our allies and friends, militarily Putin in the territory of Ukraine. Then we switch to the business as usual. Hence, we allow Putin to reform his army, to fire degenerate generals who cannot, fight, and they proved it already, to rebuild his economic strengths, and then to hit again in 5 years from now. And then it is going to be a kind of war that is not even comparable to what we see today. And then the collective West would be required to pay double, if not triple price to defend itself. So it is not about Ukraine regaining control of its territories, which is an important part of the more holistic understanding of the victory of all of us, because it is a war of Putin not against only the Ukrainians, it is the war of Putin against the collective community of democratic nations. So when people ask me, and politicians, and I have a chance to meet now and then many politicians here in New York, many members of the parliaments of Europe or European Parliament, who ask me, what is a compromise that is acceptable to you? I immediately return this question and I say, what is a compromise acceptable to the Dutch Parliament, to the German Parliament, to the Belgian Parliament, to the Spanish Parliament? Will you accept a solution that will allow Russia to remain the major threat in Europe, if not globally, that will require from you extra efforts and investments, that will put under threat the whole existence of your nations in the foreseeable future?
Just following that thought, when Putin saber rattles about use of nuclear weapons, both hints that they could be used in Ukraine and hints that he has weapons that could destroy Western cities, how seriously do you take him? How seriously does your country take him?
Well, everybody takes the issue of nuclear arsenals in the hands of Putin quite seriously. It would be very childish and irresponsible to say that politicians in Ukraine and government officials in Ukraine or wherever else in Europe, in North America, would take the threat of use of nuclear arms without necessary consideration. Will he use tactical nuclear weapons? Remains an open question. Will he survive the use of tactical nuclear weapons? No, he will not survive. I'm quite determined that the kind of response he will instantaneously get from other nuclear nations will be devastating and ultimate to his existence, and unfortunately to the existence of many Russians. I hope if worse comes to worse, and he orders the use of tactical nuclear weapons, which I believe may not happen, that kind of order will be sabotaged, because it's not literally not in his operational capacity to push one button and then the nuclear attack begins.
I have a question here that returns to the United Nations and asks, please assess honestly the performance on Ukraine of the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who initially said Russia would not invade. Then through his communications, people told other UN officials not to call it a war. And whether Guterres' sit down at the long table with Putin did anything but blue wash him.
You know, it's very easy to judge high-level officials, but put yourself in the shoes of the Secretary General or President Biden or President Zelensky. And can you give a definitive answer to the question, will you perform any better? I'm not trying to defend the Secretary General. I was frustrated with him being under impression that the invasion would never start. And I had multiple chances to talk to him before the invasion. But nevertheless, I believe that Secretary General Guterres is a very decent person. He is a person of very high moral standards. I personally respect Antonio Guterres very much. Do I agree with the line he pursued before the 24th of February? No, I do not agree. Do I appreciate that immediately after the declaration of the invasion, he took a very principled position? Yes, I do appreciate. And I think that his open, clear, and even patient declaration next to the Security Council, where he threw the hands in the air and he said, Mr. Putin, stop the war, had an important impact on many countries in the General Assembly. Do I think that his visit to Moscow and Ukraine, his visits rather, were necessary? Yes, they were necessary. Do I think that they were successful? Not as successful as we might wished, but nevertheless, his determination to be involved in humanitarian efforts to evacuate people from civilians from Mariupol, from Azovstal, played a key role. Probably not the key role, but a key role. And I been in touch with him daily. There were days when we would talk for like 3-5 times a day on that issue. And I can assure your listeners and viewers that he played and he continues to play an important role. You should also acknowledge that he is not the head of the government of the United Nations. He is not the president of the United Nations, as Biden is the president or Zelensky is the president of their respective countries. He is the highest civil servant in the UN system, employed by the countries with terms of reference as designed by the countries. And out of 111, if I'm not mistaken, articles of the UN Charter. There are only 5 charters dedicated to the role of the Secretary General that provide him with the limited abilities to act. And it is not by chance, because traditionally, from the very outset, from the very moment of conception of the United Nations, the global powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, and China were against a powerful, politically impactful Secretary General of the United Nations. Be it Dag Hammarskjöld, be it Kofi Annan, be it Guterres. And the last thing I would like to say, I would like to bring you back to the last week when, for the first time since the beginning of the war, the Security Council managed to agree a joint statement in support of the Secretary General. One of the things that your listeners may need to know is that on the insistence of the Russian Federation, the phrase about good offices of the Secretary General was removed from the text and replaced with the phrase in support of the efforts of the Secretary General, which may sound to some gibberish, but politically it is fundamentally important thing that neither the Russian Federation nor China nor perhaps some other countries in the Security Council do or are willing to allow the Secretary General to play an important political role. Thank you.
Another tragedy of our times. We have time for a brief but important answer to one last question, or maybe two, but I have been asked to ask you, what can the average American citizen do to support Ukraine?
I would give you a very simple answer. I do believe in the strengths of American democracy. In spite of many ugly moments that we all see, and in spite of the challenges to democracy, not only in the United States, but across the globe. Therefore, I think that every US citizen has an important role to play by addressing every elected official in the United States, be it a city council, be it the state Senate, be it the US Congress. Address your elected officials and demand from the elected officials to be steady in support of Ukraine. Be mindful of the need to defend the United States by helping Ukrainians to defend democracy and to defend the collective democratic community of nations. You should not really underestimate how the elected officials are mindful of the need to listen to you. So work with your elected officials.
I think that is an excellent way to end. I want to thank you very, very much. I hope your family is safe in Ukraine. Are they okay?
I should not really complain. Thank you.
And I want to remind listeners that there will be another Worldview live, Inquirer Live with Trudy Rubin on June 3rd, when the guest will be Bill Browder, who will be talking about his terrific new book on corruption and Putin's regime. And thanks again to the ambassador. And I think we should all take his last words on what Americans can do to heart. So thank you again for tuning in, and hope to see you on June 3rd, same time.